and welcome to the Exeter Hexagon. I'm Ellen Wiles, and in each episode of this series I invite a guest to tell me about their top 5 arts and culture tips for life under lockdown and beyond. Today I'm delighted to welcome my very first guest, Henry Power. Henry Power is Professor of English Literature at Exeter University, where he has taught since 2007, and he's also Associate Dean for Education across the Humanities. His first degree was in classics, and his research focuses on the ways in which English-speaking writers have responded to and reshaped ancient texts and ideas. His most recent book is Epic into Novel, which is about classical influence on 18th century literature. And he's just starting work on a new edition of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, as translated by Alexander Pope. And he's also writing a book about Homeric influence on modern poetry. So welcome, Henry. Could you start off by briefly telling me about how lockdown has been for you? Have you managed to find much time for arts and culture in this time?
How has lockdown been for me? It's been okay. I've been homeschooling, so I've got 3 children, so I've been attempting to teach them. And the quality of the homeschooling has tailed off slightly over the last few weeks, but we're keeping going.
Very familiar, yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time on Microsoft Teams. Because of my job, I'm involved with planning the teaching for next year in whatever form it takes. Yeah. And so, yes, I've been spending a lot of time talking to colleagues on Microsoft Teams. And I found that this has meant that by the time evening comes, my brain is too frazzled for me to want to look at a screen at all. So I've been reading a lot in the evening, and I have turned to, actually none of the books that I'm going to mention in a second, but I've been reading big Victorian novels. I've read Middlemarch, I'm reading Daniel Deronda, I've reread Madame Bovary. I find that at the moment I can lose myself in these big chunky novels in a way that I can't in a TV series.
Yeah, that's excellent. And how about this working life? So a lot of it's been dominated by Teams. Have there been any highlights of your life working at the university over the past year?
Over the past year? Oh, pre-lockdown.
Yeah. Well, pre and perhaps including.
I think the thing I've enjoyed most over the last year, it probably didn't take place at the university, but something that I've missed under lockdown is travelling up to the British Library. I'm never really happier than when in an archive. And I've been looking recently at Pope's manuscripts for his translations of Homer, which are just amazing documents. I mean, partly because you can see him coming to the process of, going through the process of arriving at these wonderful translations. He has beautiful handwriting, and you can see his corrections very clearly. But also, he wrote his translations on the backs of letters that he'd received. And so some of which are very important and some of which are on trivial matters. And you get a real sense of the person, both from reading his poetry and from reading these documents that he was kind of drafting the poetry on.
Yeah,
so,
and that's that interplay between his social life and then intellectual, creative productivity, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And I just had an email yesterday saying the British Library was reopening later in the summer, which is very exciting. So I may be able to get back there soon.
Oh, it's a haunt of mine too. Yeah, I hope we managed to figure out the logistics okay, sure. Great, so now time for your first arts and culture tip. Can you tell us what it's going to be and why you're recommending it?
Right, so my first tip is Thom Gunn's New Selected Poetry, or New Selected Poems. So Gunn is a favourite poem of mine, and this is a wonderful new edition that's recently been put out by Faber, edited by Clive Wilmer. So Thom Gunn was this, for those who don't know him, this English poet who moved to San Francisco just after leaving university in the 50s. And he writes poetry about all sorts of things. He writes about art, free love, cookery, sex, LSD. He writes a lot about LSD, and he writes about kind of cruising the streets of San Francisco, picking people up. And what's really interesting about him is that although the lifestyle he describes in his poetry is really bizarre and chaotic, the poetry itself is just brilliantly ordered. So he has this extraordinary interest in the possibilities of rhyme, in the possibilities of formal meter, and he's always borrowing verse forms from earlier poets, from the Romantics, from the Elizabethans, from the Greeks and the Romans. And I suppose the real reason, other than the fact that I just love his poetry, that I wanted to choose him as a lockdown tip is because had it not been for lockdown, I would have spent the second half of June looking at his papers in his archive at Berkeley. I've been given a grant to go and study his archives and write this thing on the way in which he borrows from classical poetry. So yeah, I'm thinking of being there and reading his poetry instead.
Yeah, well, I hope that chance returns for you. Yeah, I think as I understood it, earlier on he used a lot of more traditional forms and classical forms, and then moved on to more kind of free verse. Is that something that's reflected in this collection of new poems, or is it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. He kind of flits in and out of formal poetry. So he went through a real free verse phase in, I guess, the kind of 70s going into the 80s. And then for his collection, which came out, I think, in 1992, The Man with Night Sweat, which is just this extraordinary volume. I don't know if you know it. It's about his experience, really, of living through the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco in the 80s. And first of all, this wonderful account of this idyllic life that he had made for himself out there, and then just these terrible accounts of the deaths of his friends and his lovers. And the thing from a formal point of view that's fascinating about that collection is that he kind of is precisely that he returns to form, and it's as though when the subject matter is at its most kind of devastating and inchoate and difficult, I was about to say retreats into form, that's the wrong word, but he finds this kind of, the possibility of structure, the way of structuring this chaotic experience in formal meter, which is exactly what he earlier says about, writing about, he says the only way you can write about an LSD trip is by using these formal kind of Elizabethan structures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that return to form as a way of dealing with the chaos and devastation of the AIDS epidemics got some parallels in a way with contemporary poets today who are returning to form quite often as perhaps in response to the chaos of the world we're living in. Great, fascinating, thanks. So how about your second tip? Could you tell us about that?
So my second tip is Charlotte Higgins's book, Under Another Sky. And again, this is a kind of lockdown inspired choice. So this is it's her book about searching for the remains of Roman Britain. And if lockdown hadn't happened, I would have spent the first week of April walking Hadrian's Wall with my two elder children,
right.
Which obviously was, this was just as we went in, and so it was cancelled. But this was a trip that got inspired by this book, which I read last year, and I'm going to. So I haven't read it during lockdown, but I'm going to reread it this summer. So this is why it can be a lockdown tip. But it's a book that does. I guess it does three different things. So first of all, it's an account of the traces of Roman Britain, and it's really kind of detailed and informative from that point of view. And it's also the story, rather more interestingly, it's the story of people who have been inspired by them or searched for them. So it tells the story of Hadrian's Wall becoming a tourist attraction, and of the first people to have walked the wall. So in fact, the first person to walk the wall was this person called William Hutton, who did it who walked all the way across it and then all the way back in 1802, and declared at the end, he wrote this thing saying that he had spent kind of 42 guineas and lost 2 stone or whatever, and that he believed himself to be the first person to have walked the wall, and that he would also be the last. So it does all of this, and it's also just a brilliant piece of travel writing. There's this wonderful account of her driving around the country looking for these monuments and talking to people who live around them, and some really wonderful descriptions of the landscape she encounters. So yeah, and I suppose the other thing to say about it is that it's just a great introduction to the history of Roman Britain, and it's one of these slightly shameful things, but my first degree was in classics, but I found that I knew almost nothing about Roman Britain. And I suspect this may just be my blind spot, but I suspect this is true of classicists generally.
Yeah, I guess the links to the key classics text lead you to think about culture in Greece and Rome rather than here, perhaps. Yeah, and yeah, she went around in a camper van for this book, didn't she?
Yes, exactly.
How does it balance that element of the memoir? Is it more about the memoir element, or that those kind of echoes of the cultural history?
I suppose it's more about the cultural history. The thing that really struck me actually was the landscape writing. There's a very strong sense of place that she manages to capture.
Yeah.
So and she's as kind of, she's as good at There are some places where, you know, she obviously goes and she's looking at a Roman monument and she, you know, she feels that she's transporting herself back in time. But she's also very good on the moments where you're just walking along, you know, whichever a road has taken the place of a Roman road or whatever.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And how about your third tip? Can you tell us about that?
So my next tip is More Blood, More Tracks by Bob Dylan. And this is an album which contains the first takes for Dylan's album Blood on the Tracks, which is one of my favorite records, which came out in 1975. And these are the recordings that he made initially in New York before he decided to scrap everything he'd done, and then he went to Minnesota and recorded the album, which has become famous. But I really love these early takes. I don't think I've ever heard Dylan singing better than he does on these recordings. I know Dylan's voice is an acquired taste, but I have acquired it, and this is Dylan singing at his very best. And he also plays guitar really, really wonderfully on them. And there's just a real, you know, there's no other instrumentation, and there's a real kind of plainness and intimacy to them. So there are moments where you can hear his shirt sleeves kind of rattling against his guitar as he plays. And the intimacy works very well, partly because lots of the songs on the album are about obsession. This is the kind of the theme of the album. And partly because the lyrics on the record are just much simpler than they usually are for Dylan. So it's a great recording.
Yeah, I'll have to get into it. I had a quick listen after you said you were going to talk about it, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed what I heard and the rawness of it. I generally find it quite difficult to listen to Dylan at any length now, having seen him live at a festival a few years back, and it was one of the most disappointing live performances I've ever experienced, because I had great hopes, but he just seemed to be really sort of arrogantly dismissive of the audience, and he sort of barely said anything or acknowledged, you know, the presence of sort of thousands of people there. He just sat at the keyboard and played through his new stuff in this gruff voice and barely introduced it and didn't play any classic tracks. But this was just a really wonderful reminder of that, you know, that original, you know, raw talent and genius. And like you say, there's a freshness to it. So I really enjoyed discovering a bit of that. So thanks. How about your fourth tip?
Okay, so my fourth tip is an exhibition, Picasso and Paper, which I saw just before we went into lockdown. But there's a video. I guess you'll link to it, but there's a film that they've made which gives you a good sense of the exhibition. And this was at the RA, the Royal Academy. And so the kind of the theme of this exhibition is Picasso's obsession with paper, which sounds like an odd thing because I guess all artists have to be quite interested in paper. But Picasso really was into it and spent his whole life collecting bits of paper and doing strange things with them. And you get a really good sense from this exhibition just of Picasso as a collector, this obsessive collector more than anything else. So you have, in the exhibition, you have these collages made from huge pieces of discarded wallpaper. There are doodles on envelopes. There are masks that he cut out of paper tablecloths. There are, of course, the famous, wonderful collages with kind of guitars that are made of pasteboard and string and kind of, you know, brown paper light bulbs and so on. And there are drawings, more kind of straightforwardly, there are drawings on paper and etchings and lino cuts and so on. And I should say perhaps the best thing is that in the final room of the exhibition, they have this amazing film that Picasso made aged 75, and he is sitting there shirtless, kind of drinking brandy and drawing on very thin paper that's mounted on a light box. And you just get this amazing sense of someone who is completely fluent in drawing, and he's just doodling really, but he draws a kind of a rooster, and then he decides that he's going to turn it into a vase of flowers, and then he changes direction again and turns it into a fish, and he just keeps going. And the only reason he stops is because the piece of paper is full. But it's a wonderful film to see. And then there is they also have on display this kind of very scrappy bit of paper that has somehow survived, even though it's on unprinted newspaper basically.
Yeah, great. Yeah, virtual exhibitions are one of those arts and culture things that have really come into their own during the lockdown, and so I've really been meaning to go to one and haven't managed it yet. So this sounds like a a great example. Interesting that it's so to do with texture and materiality of the paper, and yet you're experiencing online. How was that? Did you feel like you did get a sense of that despite not being able
I
to?
think you get a bit of a sense of it. I mean, I suppose that, you know, at least with it's a bit more of an experience than just looking at the catalogue, because at least it can, you know, the film can move around.
Yeah.
I don't think it quite recaptures it, but yeah, I think it does a good job.
Yeah. How does it compare to an audio guide that you might get at an exhibition? Did it feel a bit like that as an experience for going around it?
But yeah. I don't know. I mean, I should say, first of all, I always reject the audio guides.
Yeah, right.
Maybe I'm missing out. Do you always take the audio guide?
Well, I rarely do, actually, but at the times I have done, I've enjoyed them. So I always mean to listen to them more, and then when it comes to it, I always feel like I just want to have my own freedom to dip in. But perhaps this is this might be one of those experiences that reminds you that it's great to have, you know, the experts' insights while you're going around.
Yes, I'm always worried with an audio guide that I'm going to be clustered around the same pictures with other people who have the audio guides.
That's probably a real bonus of this then, that you don't have that. You have this lovely empty gallery that you never get. Yeah. Excellent. And time for your final tip of the day. What is that going to be?
Great. So this is a podcast. This is Lucy Prebble talking. The podcast is called Rule of Three, I think, and it's Lucy Prebble talking about the film When Harry Met Sally. And this actually is an excuse for me to talk about, or just to mention, multiple things that I really love. And I think, so Lucy Prebble is a brilliant playwright. So she's the author of Enron. And more significantly, from my point of view, she's one of the writers on Succession, which is the brilliant, have you seen Succession?
It's on my top of my list, but I haven't yet watched it.
It really should be top of your list. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So it's this HBO series about the family of an aging media mogul. So basically he's Rupert Murdoch, and everyone, his various children are jockeying for position to succeed him. And so Lucy Prebble's a writer on that. And in this podcast, she talks really interestingly about When Harry Met Sally, which is one of the greatest films ever made, written by one of the funniest people who ever walked the planet, Nora Ephron. And she talks very interestingly about that. But actually, the bit of the podcast I was far more interested in is that she talks about how Succession is written and made. And the kind of, the point being, I suppose, that it's written by this group of English comedy writers led by Jessie Armstrong, who wrote Peep Show, was one of the writers of Peep Show. And you get this revelation from hearing her talk that Succession is modelled not on these kind of big, slick US dramas, but on the kind of traditional English family sitcom. And I have gone back, and since I listened to the podcast, gone back and started, watch the first few episodes again. And I hadn't really got how funny it is, and also how much it's written in that tradition. So it's really kind of opened up the series in a new way for me.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so glad that you picked this podcast, because it's made me even keener to watch Succession than I already was. But I have an annual ritual of watching When Harry Met Sally with my husband. You know, whenever the weather closes in, we watch it, and I just love the film to the point that I bought the script and this short BFI classic book about it. And this just made me want to watch it again immediately. It's such an incisive and knowledgeable and funny conversation, especially Lucy Prebble's insights, and just brings out that genius of the film, and its really unique depiction of love and friendship and aging, and how subtle the character development is, and how lightly executed that is. And they just dive into the choreography as well as the script. And
yes, absolutely.
And then you get the pleasure of the audio clips and some of the best bits. So I really enjoyed that. So thank you for recommending it. Great, well, what a lovely set of tips. So now it's time for my tip of the week. And actually, this time I'm going to cheat a bit and mention two things, just because I feel like I have to mention one of my lockdown highlights, even though it's no longer available online, as well as something you can still easily watch if you want to. So since lockdown began, I've been enjoying this live culture night with some friends on Zoom every Fridays. And we've watched plenty of great stuff, but we were all really blown away by the National Theatre's production of Small Island, which was streamed for free on their YouTube channel for a week back in June. And it's an adaptation of Andrea Levy's wonderful novel. by the playwright Helen Edmondson, and it's incredibly topical as a story about the Windrush generation, and explores Black British culture and identity with just this pitch perfect dark humour. And everything about the production was just perfect, from the performances to sound to the set, and its filmic backdrop showing footage of the real Windrush arrivals. So I would suggest you still check out the trailer and watch if you ever get the chance. But right now, a tip that everyone can still access online is a dance video, and it's made by Matthew Bourne's ballet company. It's called The Red Shoes from Home. You can find it on YouTube. It's just very short and sweet at 12 minutes long. But it's this mini lockdown version of the production that they were meant to be taking on tour around the world at the moment. And all the dancers perform snippets of the show from their gardens and living rooms. And it's just this little gem. It's beautiful, it's comical, it's this really authentic expression of lockdown life for many of us. And it's just this real treat to see these graceful dancers with their ridiculously perfect physiques twirling around these utterly mundane domestic settings. You know, and there's someone wearing a Crystal Palace football kit in his back garden, and someone wearing boxer shorts and a fake handlebar moustache in the living room. And it's just this really apt reminder of all the incredible live performance that's being kept off the stages right now, but needs all the support it can get to come back. So those would be my tips for today.
Wonderful.
So yeah, thanks Henry very much for sharing your recommendations, and thank you to all so much for watching this video, and I hope some of these arts and culture tips will inspire you wherever you are and however locked down you are right now. And there'll be more episodes coming soon, so I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.